It is December 7th, 2026, and the U.S. military has officially seized the Russian flagged oil tanker that is now in the North Atlantic after they have spent weeks chasing it out of the Caribbean. This is part of the Trump administration's overall war against Venezuela, where they basically act as though they can target any ship that they want anywhere as long as they can claim that it has some sort of ties to Venezuela, or maybe it carried Venezuelan oil that the US sanctioned at some point. It's as if just when you think that the US can't escalate tensions further after it just bombed a sovereign nation and kidnapped its elected leader and then declared that it was going to run the country, the Trump administration still seems to find a way. So where does that leave us, and what should we be concerned about? Well, we got into all of the latest and more with a special guest earlier, so let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is retired U.S. Army Colonel Douglas Macgregor, a defense and foreign policy analyst and former Pentagon advisor. Colonel Macgregor, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Sure, thank you.
Great to have you on the show again. Now, I want to get your take on the latest here, as we have breaking news in this morning that the U.S. military has seized a Russian flagged oil tanker in the North Atlantic after pursuing it all the way from the Caribbean Sea, claiming that it was carrying Venezuelan oil that has been sanctioned by the U.S. Will you start by giving me your reaction to this seizure and the fact that the U.S. military is being used as literal pirates in the Caribbean?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure they're going to find much on the tanker. The latest reports I've heard is that the tanker was empty. So, I don't know what they plan to do at that point. This was part of the so-called shadow fleet, which has been a thorn in the side of the neocons and others in Washington who want to enforce the sanctions against Russia. So I suppose this is a continuation of the Biden administration's approach to things with Russia. What are the consequences for us and the Russians at this point? I think this is potentially one of the last nails in the coffin of any sort of resumption of good relations with Russia. I think instead, President Trump, who from time to time has conveyed the impression, at least, that he wanted a normalization of relations with Moscow, has now turned in a very different direction. And all of his efforts with Witkoff and Kushner and others have failed miserably. I don't know what they expect to get out of anything by seizing this particular vessel. The Russians are not fools. They're not going to go to war over one empty tanker. There's no question about that. But the fact that we chose to ignore its flag, it actually violated international law, because any vessel in the open ocean that is flying a flag of another nation and is legitimately registered with that nation, which is the case with the Marinera, has to be treated as a legitimate entity, not as a potential military target. So I don't think this helps us. I don't think it improves the situation for us with Russia. We seem to have lost all interest in coming to some sort of resolution of the Ukraine conflict. And now we're focused myopically on Venezuela. This is part of that. And the opportunity here to tweak the nose of the Kremlin, I guess, was too appealing to dummies in Washington to ignore.
Yeah, it really does seem that way. You look at the Trump administration and you're going, okay, what is the goal here? And I know that this week, all Trump is seeing is Venezuelan oil, right? He gets on True Social on Tuesday and he declares that the quote, interim authorities in Venezuela will be turning over between 30 and 50 million barrels of high quality sanctioned oil to the US. So I'm curious, how do you view this decision by the Trump administration? Because they not only have bombed the sovereign nation of Venezuela, they've kidnapped its elected leader, but they now are claiming that we run the country. And according to U.S. Energy Secretary Chris Wright, they plan to control the sale of Venezuelan oil indefinitely.
Well, we'll see how that works out. I'm not sure they're going to be competing with anyone else. I don't think the Russians or the Chinese or anyone else is going to challenge us in the Southern Caribbean. So I think most of the damage to us from this behavior will have an effect inside Latin America. Everyone in Latin America is watching what's happening and has reached the worst possible conclusions about us. Many people who otherwise might be sympathetic to us because of our opposition to the drug cartels and the human trafficking are now, I think, largely opposed to us and anything we want to do. It's not just Venezuela. Now, having said that, the best estimates are that it will be several years before we see 3 million barrels a day. 3 million barrels a day haven't been pumped out of Venezuela for decades. That's number one. Number two, that we're going to have to compensate the oil corporations if we can persuade them to go in. And right now they're dragging their feet. But if we can get them to go in, then we're going to have to pay them handsomely for doing it because they see this as super high risk. The people in the oil business look at this and say, well, there are a lot better places to go at this point. This is a troublesome client. We've poisoned the waters against ourselves. Actions have not endeared us to the Venezuelan people. How do we know that this is going to be a secure place from which we can extract oil? Remember that there are also gold mines, iron ore mines, emerald mines, rare earths, bauxite, copper, a lot of different things. We want to get our hands on all of those things as well, but much of that is in the interior. The interior of Venezuela looks like the highlands of Vietnam, triple canopy jungle. It's enormous inside, and the transportation infrastructure is not very well developed. Most of the Spanish and Portuguese colonies, when they established them, they built along the rivers, and what roads they built ran to the coast from the interior. Well, there are very few of those, but that's about it. In other words, there's no developed transportation infrastructure across Venezuela. Then you have the probability of some resistance. An awful lot of weapons have been distributed inside Venezuela to all of Maduro's supporters. I think if we were to go in there militarily, it would end up being one giant ambush. So what if you can't change Venezuela? And I don't think you can. I mean, it's interesting that people are now talking about sending in a team to help govern the place. I mean, I find it laughable. We went through this in Iraq. See just how much we successfully changed. Perhaps the most important thing we changed in Iraq was to transform it from being an essentially secular Arab state into, once again, an Islamic state. In fact, we even enshrined Islam as the state religion in the Constitution, and it was not the case when we went in. So what kinds of damage can we do in Venezuela? It's anybody's guess. We were in Cuba before 1939 3 times. In other words, the military intervened there 3 times. We supervised elections. We ultimately wrote the Cuban Constitution. What's Cuba look like? So I'm one of these people that would say, if I were advising the president, I would say, Mr. President, let's work with this existing government if we can. Now, a lot of people are going to say you can't do that because they're criminals. They're part of the very thing that we removed Maduro for. Okay. The probability of systematically eliminating everyone in the infrastructure of the government that was part of the scam, the graft, the grift, whatever you want to call it, is low. And if you do, who's going to run it? Are you going to bring in people from the United States? I'm not sure that's going to be well received. So we have this team that is set up that includes people like Stephen Miller and ostensibly Secretary Rubio. Secretary Rubio knows something about Iberian Catholic culture in Latin America, and I would think that he could sit down and talk to the president about the perils of going in to try and fundamentally change the place. And if he does that, then the president may say, well, let's see what we can do to work with these people. Is that going to be more fruitful? I don't know. It could be in the short run. In the long run, I think all of these countries always revert to what I call a cultural mean. In other words, if you want to look at what's the future of say, Colombia, well, look at Venezuela, look at Peru. And that tells you a little bit about where Colombia may be down the line. In other words, you want to understand Iraq, look at Iran, look at Turkey, look at Saudi Arabia. That'll tell you a little bit about where Iraq is going to go. But don't look at Iraq and say in 10 years it'll look like Sweden. That's absurd. It never will. So let's not say that if we go into Venezuela in 10 years it'll look like Southern California. I don't think so. So if we're sober minded and we look at these things objectively, the best that we can hope for is something akin to what is now, I think, being seriously discussed behind closed doors, which is let's work with this existing government, see how it goes. Now, if it doesn't go well, I predict that in 2, 3, or 4 weeks, they'll stop talking about it. I mean, literally, they will.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll change the subject. And that'll be easy to do because I suspect by then we'll be at war with Iran. We don't know what else may happen. The situation in Ukraine will change. I think the Russians will cross the Dnieper River. They'll seize Odessa. They're certainly going to take Kharkov. They may go into Kiev. They may not have any choice in terms of finally rooting it out and getting rid of it. All of these things are going to be far more important to us strategically, I suppose, than what's going on. In the meantime, his domestic policy positions, many of which I support, I believe in election integrity. I believe that every American citizen should prove his citizenship when he goes to vote. He should show the government ID. I am a citizen. I should vote. I'm 100% for that. He's talking about that. Well, if that's going to happen, that has to be enforced. That has to go through a legislative process. We need new legislation because the Constitution historically says elections are a local state problem. Now, the reason for that was that at the time the Constitution was written, we had no federal government. We had no taxes. We had no money. But the people with money, the people that collected taxes, were the 13 colonies. So we said, we can't do it, so it's up to you to do it. Now, that was okay in 1787. Hasn't worked very well in the 20th century. It's been a disaster over the last 40 or 50 years because of all the corruption and irregularities and problems at the local level. I wish he'd focus on that. Fix those things. Those are very important. But all of that is not being ignored, but it's in third or fourth place when you start to focus on a place like Venezuela.
Yeah, and I'm with you. I'm surprised that he's not spending more time talking about domestic policy and what he's doing or what he plans to do there. The last thing I wanted to bring up about Venezuela, because I thought it was interesting, right? You've seen this massive push for the overthrow of Maduro, and we all can look at it and go, yeah, Marco Rubio is the Secretary of State, right? That's something he supports. Trump tried to achieve it during his first term. That's going to be something he supports. But as far as people that stand to make a lot of money, I know that some eyes right now are looking at billionaire Paul Singer. He is, of course, a top donor to AIPAC, Trump, Rubio. Oh, and his firm, Elliott Investment Management, purchased Citgo back in November in a bit of a shady deal forced by a Delaware court for just under $6 billion. Now, reports are saying that Paul Singer was then starting to really push for the overthrow of Maduro. How do you see it there when it comes to all of kind of the inner workings of how this was pushed forward? Do you think that Paul Singer was a big part of it, or do you think he was just kind of right place at the right time and knew how to profit from something that the Trump administration was trying to make happen?
Well, no one is better than Paul Singer at detecting failure and problems and moving in and profiting from it. That's why he is termed a vulture capitalist. And there are lots of them out there. He's by no means a lone ranger. I think he is one of several billionaire donors who has enormous influence over what we do or don't do. Now, does he influence every policy decision? No. But these are the people that helped elect Donald Trump and his team to office. And so it is not surprising that the president and his team turned to BlackRock. Larry Fink, I guess, is out now. He's leaving BlackRock. He's at the WEF. I don't know who is running BlackRock, but BlackRock was with Kushner and Witkoff involved in Ukraine. And this goes back to Zelensky early on. And you remember there was a wonderful example of this. It was a Zoom session or a StreamYard session with Bankman-Fried, who is now thankfully in jail, Zelensky, and then Fink on the other end, all talking about these grandiose plans for Ukraine that were designed, whether or not they were going to do any good for Ukraine is open to debate, but they were certainly designed to make those people very rich. We think that Zelensky's got $1 billion in his various bank accounts and so forth. So I think we're dealing with one huge exercise in, sadly, what people are calling legalized grift, legalized bribery. And I think President Trump looks on this and is accustomed to this from his experience in New York City in the real estate game. New York is a place where a lot of things happen that probably can't happen other places. And I think President Trump has decided that these kinds of things can happen in the world when others in the past have said no. I think it's one of these things. Is it really illegal for his family, involving Kushner and Witkoff and other friends of his, to profit on the side as foreign policy experts, or at least representatives of the president in foreign policy? I don't know. I rather think it should be illegal if it's not. But if it's not, it certainly paints a very grim picture of the United States. I was talking to a friend about this, and he related to me something I'd forgotten about. That when we bought the Louisiana territory, the famous Louisiana Purchase, we sent representatives over to negotiate and then ultimately to pay Napoleon for the purchase. And these people were all very fluent in French, and Napoleon was very impressed with the American representatives. And Napoleon was a very charming man anyway. He walked them out to the carriage from Fontainebleau, from which they would be then sent to the harbor and go back to the United States on ship. And as they began to get into the carriage, he reached in his pocket and he started passing out solid gold francs. He said, "Well, I want you to have this. This is my personal gratitude for your wonderful work, please." And they stood there and they said, "But Your Majesty, we can't take any of this." He said, "You can't take it? Of course you can. This is what we do here. Everybody does this." And they said, "No, we can't do that. We can't take it, Your Majesty. We represent the Republic. We have strict rules. And what you're effectively doing, and we appreciate it very much, we appreciate the gift, but it will be seen in a very negative light in Washington. It will be viewed as bribery." And so Bonaparte shrugged his shoulders and said, "I've never seen this before. This is a new one." Stuck the francs back in his pocket. Well, we certainly have strayed very, very far from those days. And this administration is probably in the lead among those that have engaged in this kind of behavior. Not that we haven't seen it before. Well, we can go back to LBJ during the Vietnam War, when his wife was a principal stockholder in Bell Helicopter. And suddenly Bell Helicopter received all the contracts for most of the helicopter purchases by the U.S. Army and Marines. We've been down this road before. We've seen this kind of thing. This is probably the worst, though. And it's interesting because it all happens at a point in time when the old order is disintegrating. NATO is disintegrating. Ukraine is destroyed. If you're going to have a meeting about Ukraine, it's like going to a funeral. And the body is laid out on the table here. And people are saying, "Well, what do we do?" Well, you take the leg. I'll take the arm. I really want the following body parts. That's about where we are with Ukraine. The EU is dying. It's falling apart. You've already got member states that have said, "The hell with the EU." Everybody in Europe hates the EU that I've talked to. The average European on the street wants nothing to do with it. The point is that this is where we are. And I see these sharks sort of circling and moving in for the kill, to profit as much as possible. And unfortunately, this all happens with, I'm sure, the knowledge and understanding of President Trump. I think it's a mistake. I don't think it's right. I think it's wrong. But that's where we are.
Yeah, it's incredibly concerning to watch. And exactly as you're noting there, anytime that I see Jared Kushner start showing up and now he's hand in hand with Steve Witkoff, and I'm going, okay, this doesn't look right here. And even this week, I know it hasn't gotten as much coverage as it probably normally would have if you didn't have all of the news around Venezuela. But you have this meeting of the so called coalition of the willing. And it's just ridiculous. Every day we get new headlines of, oh, the UK and France have agreed to deploy such and such number of soldiers. And it's like, yeah, they would be sending them there to die, right? This is not a good situation all around. And yet, the Trump administration, the same one where Trump campaigned so hard on ending this war, now we find ourselves in a position where it feels like they're just looking at Ukraine going, okay, what peace can we get here, right? With no actual plan on how do we end this war? How do we, stop the killing, which is what Trump claims that he wants to do? How do you see the situation in Ukraine and kind of the current US approach to it?
I think that we've largely abdicated our responsibility as the leaders of NATO. That's been my feeling from the beginning. Now, I've always been a critic of NATO as something that I think should have gone away in the 90s. That once the Soviet state system collapsed, we should have then said, well, there's no real requirement for or rationale for NATO. And we should have turned to the Europeans and said, well, we're going to back down from this. We're not going to be the lead anymore. We want a European officer to be the four-star in command. We want Europeans to take the lead. We'll continue to back you and support you, but the world has changed. Well, the problem with that is that nobody wanted the world to change. The Europeans were comfortable being taken care of by us, like children in a sort of, what's the right word, kindergarten or something.
Right.
And the Americans, everything is mortgaged to vanity. We wanted to be the big honcho. We enjoy being in charge and being in command. It flatters us. And so the motto at the time was you're either out of area. In other words, you drag the Europeans into other places you want to go. You drag them into the Balkans. You drag them into Iraq. You drag them into Afghanistan, into Libya, whatever. Or they go out of business. NATO goes out of business. And I remember, because I was very close to a number of European officers, many of whom were Germans, they had absolutely no interest whatsoever in being dragged into these conflicts overseas. There was no history of German involvement in those, and the Germans thought that we should be grateful that the war was over and focus on what was happening in Europe. Well, that didn't happen. And later on, now I have French contacts who just sort of respond with, comments along the lines of someone's lost their mind in Paris because we have no one to send to Ukraine. And if they tell us to send someone, we can send maybe 5,000-10,000 troops. How do we sustain them? And how long will they last in any kind of fight with the Russians? And the answer is obviously not very long. So they think it's ridiculous. I'm sure there are British people that feel the same way, British officers, but at the top, the leadership is politicized, much as we have politicized our senior military leadership. That's also happened. And that's been true for some time. And so no one is going to stand up and say, this is a very dumb idea. And I don't think we should consider it. And if you push me, well, I'll have to retire and you can find someone else. Now, we did have that happen in Southcom, but I don't know the details behind it. I don't know the background on it, and whether or not the man left because he was objecting to the course of action that was being developed at the time. But my point is, everything is literally disintegrating. We can't put it back together again, and no one is looking at what we can do in the future. They're only focused on how do we profit from the disintegration in the best ways possible. And I think that's Washington. Washington is all about money. I hate to be blunt, but unless you're going to show up and you have lots of money, not very many people are going to pay a great deal of attention to you. The notion that there is some sort of altruistic purpose behind what happens in Washington is absurd. I think Americans are figuring it out. It's just worse now than I think I've ever seen it. It's always been there, but it's worse now. I mean, I used to go in and talk to people about the armed forces and things that needed to be done. And what they were really interested in, bases. How many bases? And if you told them, well, we have too many senior officers, it's ridiculous, we look like a banana republic. They said, yeah, but that 4-star headquarters brings a lot of money into my district. It brings money into my state. It allows me to meddle. And the corporate sector loves that because they can go to that 4 star. And if he doesn't want to do something, they've got another 40 to deal with that they can go to sell their wares. Whole thing's out of control. So Washington itself is, is in a state of permanent institutional obsolescence.
Oh, absolutely. I'm right there with you as I'm watching this and going, okay, you're looking for ways to profit off of it. You're also looking for ways to kind of see how much you can meddle into the multipolar world, right? You've got reports saying that one of the many demands, because of course, while the Trump administration is trying to work with the remains of the government in Venezuela, Trump has a long list of demands, and they're saying that one of them is that Venezuela has to cut off its oil trade with, say, Russia, China, and Iran. And as I'm looking at all of this, I know we've been waiting and watching for months to see when the next attack against Iran is going to come. And then Netanyahu goes to Mar-a-Lago and he's there for several days and he's celebrating New Year's with President Trump. And I'm looking at that and I'm going, that does not look good. So, where do your concerns stand for really the next phase of the war with Iran and how soon the US and Israel could try to pursue that?
Military assets, including ammunition and rockets and missiles and these kinds of things, as well as naval vessels and all, are moving in that direction. I think we're going to see Israel renew its war, so to say, against Iran. You also have this sort of misleading notion that Iran is ripe to fall like a rotten fruit into everybody's lap. That somehow or another millions of people in Iran are going to rush into the streets and cheer the arrival of all these bombs from the United States and Israel because it's Liberation Day. You know, we're getting rid of all the people we don't like. We're going to live in a new world. So that's not true. What we've been seeing in Iran is evidence for disputes between conservatives and reformers, which is a good thing. And the reformers are having an enormous impact. We've seen that. It's going to continue. But that doesn't mean that everyone there is prepared to embrace Israel and the United States. These people are, in a national sense, more tightly organized and more cohesive than I think they've been in their history, at least for 20, 30 years. So I think the Iranians know that they're on the target list, and I think they'll be prepared. We'll see what happens. My greatest concern has always been that in a state of frustration or fear, Israel turns to the use of a nuclear weapon. That would be catastrophic. And that's one of the reasons that we continue to keep our hands in it. I know that. And yes, we are unconditionally supportive of whatever the Israelis want to do. No one talks about the ceasefire that was brokered, this great golden era that was inaugurated by President Trump with the ceasefire in Gaza, because it's meaningless. People are killed there on a routine basis, and frankly, the media doesn't report it. Very little gets out about it. Nobody cares. And if you raise any objections to it, well, then you're branded an anti-Semite. But being continually called an anti-Semite is beginning to have less and less effect. At some point, you get tired of it. The people that are being accused of it are tired of it. And it no longer has the impact that it once did. And when you ask, well, what's the definition of an anti-Semite? Well, it's whatever the Jewish community or the Israeli community decides to say. And then you try to pass laws to enforce that sort of thing. That makes matters worse. It doesn't help things at all. So all of these things are bound up together. It's all going to come apart at the seams at some point. We haven't talked about the financial system. I don't think we need to. You've got Ray Dalio out there, Warren Buffett. You know, they'll talk to you about it. Nassim Taleb. Where are we headed? Everybody says the same thing, Armageddon. Then the next question is, when does it happen? And everybody says, well, it could be next week. Could be tomorrow. It's coming. Well, that too deserves attention. I suspect that's going to intrude quite a bit and change people's plans and expectations.
Yeah, especially when you look at the fact that so many of these conflicts that the US is pursuing could end in nuclear warfare, right? Whether it's the US versus Russia or it's Israel getting hit a little bit too hard by Iran and deciding to turn to the nuclear option. It just keeps escalating. The last thing I wanted to bring up, because I know that we are still at the beginning of 2026, and when Trump was asked what his New Year's resolution was, he said it was peace on earth. And then he turns around and he bombs Venezuela. So when it comes to kind of overall US foreign policy in 2026, what are you keeping an eye on? And what do you think that the US is prepared for?
I don't think that the United States today is prepared for a major war with either Russia or China, let alone both. So let's be clear about that. I read yesterday about intentions to produce somewhere between 600 and 2,000 Patriot missiles and new contracts arriving with Lockheed Martin and presumably Raytheon. This would also include all the things that go into supporting those missiles, including radars and technicians and so forth. Even if all that comes true and happens quickly, which is unlikely, that's a drop in the bucket. Because when you go into a war like the one that we saw the last time between Iran and Israel, the Israelis are compelled to fire 2 to 3 missiles at every one incoming missile. In other words, 2 to 3 air defense missiles against one incoming theater ballistic missile or cruise missile or hypersonic missile. And of course, we already know we can't shoot the hypersonic missiles down. That's simply not possible given the speeds. So what does that mean for the future? It means that we really need to avoid wars that involve opponents who can produce in quantity these kinds of missiles, because we can't compete. And remember, China now has the largest manufacturing base in the world. China, in many ways, is where we were in 1943, 44, and 45 during World War II. We went from, I would say, 40 miles per hour to 150 in the space of a few hours, if you want an analogy. And that huge explosion in manufacturing capability came about for many reasons. But the point is, when the war ended, we were able to turn that around and make the manufacturing base as effective in the commercial sector as it had been in the military sector. And we've lived on that manufacturing base into the 80s when we began exporting it. So today we manufacture almost nothing. And most of what we do manufacture is military equipment. Now, China is in a very different position. As I said, they're where we were. They're really exploding globally. They probably account for 50% of world gross domestic product. They're keeping the world afloat, if you will. Things would be much worse for us if it were not for China. So I don't know if the Chinese will continue to play with us, play ball with us, so to say. At some point, they say, shed the debt, dump the treasuries, the hell with it. And, what does that do to us? What our supply chain access is already diminished because supply chains have oriented away from us and towards China. China is dominating supply chains. Put all of these things together, and I think the outlook is potentially grim. You would think under those circumstances, someone in Washington would want to chart a different course, especially given President's very ambitious domestic agenda, which I support. So I don't know what to make of it except to say that it can't work. Just as LBJ's Great Society and the Vietnam War, between the two of them, we were bankrupt. That's why we went off the gold standard. One would think that should inform thinking in Washington, but it doesn't seem to.
Yeah, it really doesn't. And you look at them and you go, okay, what is your plan here, right? How are you going to get from point A to point B? And it'll certainly be interesting to see how things unfold, both in the foreign policy sector and here at home. And I always appreciate you taking the time to join me to break down all of the latest here. Retired U.S. Army Colonel Douglas Macgregor, a defense and foreign policy analyst and former Pentagon advisor. Thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment, and as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you'll find ad-free videos and new weekly episodes of my exclusive series for paid subscribers called Sanctioned. You can also check out Sanctioned over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Rachel Blevins. As always, thank y'all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.